A single missing keystroke in a galactic database. That's all it took to send a hardened JSOC operator into a colony of frail, pacifist civilians. When ruthless cartel pirates boarded their transport expecting helpless sheep, they didn't realize a bureaucratic typo had just locked them in a cage with a wolf. John Hayes did not belong on the SS Demeter. Anyone with eyes could see it. In a departure lounge filled with soft-handed agronomists, jittery sociologists, and idealistic young families heading to the frontier colony of Kepler, 186F, John looked like a stray piece of rebar in a pile of marshmallows. He was 42, though the mileage on his face suggested another decade. He sat with his back against the bulkhead, his eyes constantly scanning the room in a rhythmic, unbreakable pattern. Doors, hands, blind spots, exits. John was a ghost. Officially, his file read Government Logistics Contractor. Unofficially, he was a retired Tier 1 operator from the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, better known as Delta Force. After 2 decades of Black Ops deployments in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, he had transitioned into the private sector. He took high-threat contracts for groups like Constellation Risk Solutions and Academy, doing the dirty, quiet work that the newly formed United Earth Coalition preferred to keep off the books. His latest contract was supposed to be a security advisory role on Aegis Prime, a hostile, contested mining world on the Outer Rim. It paid a ridiculous sum, enough to finally let him disappear to a cabin in Montana. But bureaucracy is the ultimate equalizer, and artificial intelligence is only as smart as the exhausted clerks inputting the data. At the Seoul Relocation Hub, a low-level processing clerk named Peter Jenkins had been working a 14-hour shift. When John's heavily redacted, DARPA-encrypted file hit Jenkins' terminal, the system demanded an occupation code. Jenkins, fighting off sleep, meant to type Code 88, Private Military Contractor, High-Risk Escort. Instead, his finger slipped. He typed Code 8, Agricultural Technician, Class 4. Because John's real background was sealed beneath layers of Black Project NDAs, the system accepted the override without a second thought. His boarding pass was printed, routing him not to the heavily armored mercenary cruiser heading to Aegis Prime, but to the SS Demeter, an unarmed, retrofitted civilian freighter bound for an agricultural utopia. When John had boarded, he assumed the civilian ship was his cover. Standard covert insertion, he had thought. Blend in with the sheep, ride to the transit hub, link up with the contact. It wasn't until they were 3 days into a 4-week faster-than-light jump that the reality set in. "Mr. Hayes?" a cheerful voice had asked. John had blinked, looking down at a frail, bespectacled man in a ship uniform. It was Dr. Arthur Bennett, the expedition's chief botanist. "I was looking over the roster. We're so thrilled to have a Class 4 tech on board. Your expertise in hydroponic soil aeration is going to be vital when we break ground on the new settlement." John had stared at the man, his mind rapidly calculating the situation. He didn't know the first thing about soil aeration. He knew how to breach a reinforced compound with C4 and clear a room in under 3 seconds. "There's been a mistake," John had replied, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that made Dr. Bennett instinctively take a half-step back. He marched to the ship's purser, demanding to contact Constellation Risk Solutions. But the Demeter was deep in the slipstream. There was no quantum comms linked to Earth. He was trapped on a floating tin can with 3,000 civilians, a cargo hold full of heirloom seeds, and a security force consisting of 6 rent-a-cops whose idea of a threat was a drunken dispute in the cafeteria. For the first 2 weeks, it was psychological torture. The sheer, overwhelming peace of the ship gnawed at him. His brain, hardwired for hypervigilance, found no outlet. He spent his days in the hydroponics bay, aggressively pruning tomato plants while mentally mapping every inch of the ship. He noted the fatal flaws in the vessel's layout, the lack of reinforced bulkheads, the easily bypassed security locks, the complete absence of a localized armory. The ship's security detail, a budget outfit called Trident Defense, carried low-voltage stun batons. John had watched one of the guards struggle to secure his own duty belt. If this ship gets hit, John thought grimly, it'll be a slaughter. He tried to keep to himself, but the civilians, in their naive, optimistic way, kept trying to include him. Sarah Jenkins, a primary school teacher, tried to invite him to game nights. "Doctor," Bennett kept asking his opinion on synthetic fertilizers. John gave monosyllabic answers, his cold, detached demeanor earning him the nickname the Grinch of Deck 4. They thought he was just a grumpy, antisocial farmer. They had absolutely no idea what was coiled beneath his skin. The illusion of safety shattered on day 21. John was in the middle of a brutal, solitary workout in the ship's cramped maintenance access corridor, doing one-armed pull-ups on an overhead pipe when the gravity plating suddenly spiked, then dropped. A deafening metallic groan echoed through the ship's hull. The lights flickered, died, and were instantly replaced by the sickly red glow of emergency illumination. John dropped to the deck, landing silently. His heart rate, which had been elevated from the workout, instantly steadied. The adrenaline was a familiar, cold friend. The ship's intercom crackled to life, but it wasn't the captain. It was an automated warning. Hull breach detected. Airlock 4 compromised. Unauthorized boarding in progress. The Demeter had been yanked out of FTL. Up on the bridge, Captain Alistair Reed was staring in sheer terror at the tactical display. They were in the dead zone of the Perseus arm. Clamped onto their port side was a heavily modified Corsair frigate. These weren't standard pirates. The transponder codes matched the Voss Cartel. They were a ruthless syndicate known for hijacking colonial ships, stripping them of high-value cargo, and taking the passengers to sell in the deep space labor camps of the Outer Rim. "Deploy security to Deck 4!" Captain Reed shouted, his voice cracking. "Lock down the civilian sectors!" Down on Deck 4, the Trident security guards were panicking. 4 of them stacked up near the breached airlock, their hands shaking violently as they held their stun batons. They had never seen real combat. The airlock doors blew inward with a concussive blast that threw 2 of the guards into the wall. Through the smoke strode the boarders. There were a dozen of them in the first wave. Hardened mercenaries wearing scavenged tactical armor and carrying kinetic assault rifles. At their head was a massive brute holding a short-barreled scattergun. "Drop the sticks!" the pirate leader barked. The Trident guards surrendered immediately, dropping to their knees and pleading for their lives. The pirates laughed, securing the guards with zip ties and stepping over them to access the ship's main corridors. "Cut the comms, secure the bridge, and start herding the meat into the main cargo bay," the pirate leader ordered into his comms piece. "Anybody resists, shoot them in the legs." Panic swept through the Demeter. Alarms blared as civilians ran screaming through the corridors. Pirates systematically kicked in doors, dragging terrified families out of their quarters. The soft, gentle utopia of the colony ship had evaporated in less than 5 minutes. John Hayes was standing in the shadows of the hydroponics sector. He watched a group of terrified colonists, including Dr. Bennett and Sarah, being pushed down the main concourse by 3 armed cartel enforcers. One of the pirates shoved Dr. Bennett hard, sending the older man sprawling to the deck. When Bennett cried out in pain, the pirate raised the butt of his rifle to strike him. John closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. He took a deep, slow breath, pulling the air into the bottom of his lungs. He let the frustration, the annoyance of the past 3 weeks, and the civilian mask burn away. When he opened his eyes, the agricultural technician was gone. The operator had returned. He had no armor, no firearm, no comms. He was wearing canvas work pants, a gray t-shirt, and heavy boots. But in John's world, a weapon was simply an extension of the will. And the Demeter was full of tools. He reached onto a nearby workbench and grabbed a heavy-duty titanium pruning shear. It was roughly the size of a combat knife, razor-sharp and balanced. In his other hand, he grabbed a heavy, solid steel hydrospanner. The 3 pirates were busy laughing at the cowering botanist, their situational awareness virtually zero. They were used to preying on the weak. They had no idea how to handle a predator. John moved. He didn't run, he flowed. He closed the 20-yard gap in seconds, his footfalls completely silent on the metal grating. The pirate standing over Dr. Bennett didn't even have time to register the shadow falling over him. John swung the heavy hydrospanner in a brutal, perfect arc. It connected with the side of the pirate's helmet with a sickening crack, caving in the polycarbonate visor and dropping the man instantly to the floor, his brain effectively scrambled. The second pirate spun around, raising his rifle, eyes wide with shock. He expected a fleeing civilian. He met a flying titanium pruning shear. John drove the sharp tool directly upward, up under the pirate's chin, bypassing the kinetic armor entirely. The pirate made a wet, gurgling sound and slumped backward. The third pirate, a seasoned merc, stepped back and raised his weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger. But John was already moving inside the man's guard. With terrifying speed, John grabbed the barrel of the rifle, forcing it upward just as it discharged a burst of fire into the ceiling. Simultaneously, John pivoted, driving his knee into the pirate's abdomen, followed by a devastating elbow strike to the throat. The pirate collapsed, gasping for air that would no longer come. Total elapsed time, 6 seconds. The corridor was suddenly dead silent, save for the blaring emergency alarms. The civilians, huddled on the floor, stared in absolute paralyzing horror. They looked at the 3 bodies on the deck, and then up at the man they thought was just a grumpy farmer. John stood over the dead men. His breathing was completely even. He looked down, reached out, and unslung the kinetic assault rifle from the nearest pirate. He checked the magazine, slapped it back in, and pulled the charging handle, chambering around with a sharp mechanical clack that echoed down the hall. He stripped the pirate's tactical vest and slid it over his own shoulders. He took their spare magazines, a combat knife, and a fragmentation grenade. He was no longer unarmed. Dr. Bennett, trembling uncontrollably, looked up at him. Mr. Hayes? What are you doing? John looked at the botanist, his eyes entirely devoid of emotion. Pest control, John said softly. He pointed down the hall toward the maintenance hatch. Take these people. Get into the ventilation sublevel. Lock the pressure doors and do not open them for anyone. Understand? But there are dozens of them, Sarah stammered, tears streaming down her face. They have guns. They're taking over the ship. John turned his back to them, facing the dark corridor where more shouting and the heavy thud of pirate boots could be heard approaching. He raised the rifle, settling the stock perfectly into his shoulder. Good, John whispered, a dark, terrible focus settling over him. It saves me the trouble of hunting them down. He stepped into the shadows, moving toward the sound of the enemy. The paperwork error had brought the wolves to the sheep, but it was the wolves who were about to be slaughtered. The bridge of the SS Demeter smelled of ozone, fear, and the acrid smoke of a synthetic stim stick. Garrett Rourke, the commanding officer of the Voss Cartel boarding party, exhaled a thick cloud of gray vapor as he looked out over the main tactical console. Rourke was a massive man, his body a patchwork of cybernetic enhancements and scar tissue earned in the lawless asteroid belts of the Jovian colonies. Report, Rourke barked, tapping his armored knuckles against the console. At the communications terminal, his technical specialist, a weaselly man named Gideon, was frantically typing across 3 separate keypads. Decks 1, 2, and 3 are secure, boss. We've got about 800 meat sacks corralled in the main cafeteria, and my boys are sweeping the residential quarters for stragglers. Security forces are completely neutralized. The captain is locked in his ready room. Rourke grinned, a predatory flash of metal teeth. Too easy. These colonial transports are like floating piggy banks. What about Deck 4? Hydroponics and engineering? Gideon frowned, tapping his earpiece. I lost contact with Miller's squad about 10 minutes ago. They were supposed to secure the botanical labs. Comms are probably spotty because of the ship's FTL shielding. Rourke dismissed, turning away. Send Donovan and a heavy fire team down there to check on them. Tell them to hurry it up. I want this ship stripped. The high-value targets loaded onto our frigate and the scuttling charges planted in an hour. Deep in the bowels of the SS Demeter, John Hayes was already altering Rourke's timeline. The ship's environmental systems hummed a low, steady drone that masked the sound of John's footsteps. He had abandoned the main corridors entirely. Instead, he was navigating the labyrinthine network of maintenance shafts and ventilation ducts that ran like arteries through the ship. To a civilian, these spaces were claustrophobic, dark, and confusing. To a Delta Force operator, they were highways. He paused above a slatted vent, peering down into the engineering sublevel. Through his scavenged tactical earpiece, he listened to the pirate comms network. He hadn't just taken the dead men's weapons, he had taken their radios. He now knew their call signs, their deployment numbers, and their blind spots. Donovan to boss. A gruff voice crackled in John's ear. We're on Deck 4. Found Miller and his boys. There. Boss, they're dead. What do you mean dead? Rourke's voice snapped back over the frequency. Security has stun batons! It wasn't stun batons, Garrett, Donovan replied, his voice tight with unease. Miller's neck is snapped. The other two have kinetic burns at point-blank range, and one of them took a hydro-spanner to the face. The security grunts are all tied up in the corner, crying. They said some farmer did this. Said he moved like a shadow. There was a long, heavy silence on the radio. "Lock it down," Rourke finally ordered. "Nobody goes anywhere alone. Shoot anything that isn't wearing cartel colors." John smirked in the darkness. The OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, act. It was the fundamental cycle of combat. Rourke and his men were reacting to old information, stuck in the orientation phase. John was 3 steps ahead, dictating the tempo of the engagement. He was inside their loop. He dropped silently from the vent into a dimly lit maintenance bay, landing in a crouch. He checked the kinetic rifle, 30 rounds. He had 2 spare magazines and 1 fragmentation grenade. It was a meager loadout, but against an undisciplined enemy, it was an arsenal. "Hello?" a trembling voice whispered from behind a massive coolant tank. John pivoted, the rifle instantly snapping up and leveling at the source of the noise. His finger rested millimeters from the trigger. A man in grease-stained coveralls slowly raised his hands, his face pale with terror. "Don't shoot! I'm the chief engineer, Thomas Farrell! Please!" John lowered the weapon slightly, his eyes scanning the periphery before returning to Farrell. "Are you alone?" "Yes." "The pirates dragged my team up to Deck 2. I was fixing a manifold inside the tank casing when they breached. They didn't see me." Farrell stared at the blood on John's boots, then at the pirate tactical vest he was wearing over his civilian t-shirt. You're the Class 4 Ag Tech. Mr. Hayes. "What the hell is going on?" "Change of plans, Thomas," John said, his voice a calm, flat baritone that commanded absolute authority. He stepped over to a secondary systems terminal on the wall. "Log in. I need a localized schematic of Deck 3, and I need you to override the atmospheric controls for Sector 7. Farrell scrambled out from behind the tank, his hands shaking so badly he could barely type his passcode. "Sector 7? That's the main transit hub. There are at least 15 pirates holding a choke point there." "I know," John said. "Can you access the primary lighting relays for that sector?" "Yes, but the bridge has primary lockout." "Bypass it. Reroute the power through the localized life support grid. When I give you the signal, I want you to strobe the lights in Sector 7. Random intervals, no rhythm. Turn it into a disco. Can you do that?" Farrell swallowed hard, nodding. "Yeah, I can do that. But what are you going to do?" John checked the action on his rifle one last time. "I'm going to thin the herd. Stay here. Barricade the door. If anyone comes through that isn't me, you hit them with a wrench." John slipped back into the shadows before Farrell could even process the command. He moved up the maintenance ladder to Deck 3, emerging into a narrow access corridor adjacent to the Sector 7 transit hub. He pressed his back against the cold steel of the bulkhead, taking a tactical mirror, a polished piece of chrome he'd snapped off a bathroom fixture, and angled it around the corner. Farrell was right. 15 pirates were clustered in the wide-open transit concourse. They were highly armed, but terribly deployed. They were bunched up, smoking, talking loudly, and looking everywhere but the fatal funnel, the narrow choke point where John was currently standing. They were relying on their overwhelming firepower to intimidate, utterly neglecting basic perimeter security. John tapped his comms earpiece, broadcasting on an encrypted maintenance channel he had set up with Farrell, Thomas. Now, the lights in the sprawling transit hub abruptly died, plunging the concourse into pitch blackness. A second later, the emergency halogens flared to life, but only for a fraction of a second before plunging back into darkness. Flash. Dark. Flash. Dark. Panic erupted among the pirates. "What the hell is going on?" one of them screamed, blindly raising his weapon. "Who cut the power?" The strobe effect was violently disorienting, completely destroying their night vision and throwing their depth perception into chaos. John didn't hesitate. He stepped out from cover, the kinetic rifle pulled tight to his shoulder. In the erratic flashes of light, he was nothing but a strobe-lit phantom. He didn't spray and pray. He used controlled surgical bursts. Pop, pop. The pirate nearest the corridor went down, a double tap to the chest. Pop, pop. The next man beside him dropped, his knee shattering before a round took him in the sternum. "Contact! We're taking fire!" a pirate shrieked, firing wildly into the darkness. Tracers lit up the concourse, ricocheting off the bulkheads and shattering the reinforced glass of the transit tubes. But John was already moving. He flowed like water, never staying in one place for more than a second. The strobe lights masked his movement perfectly. To the terrified pirates, it looked as if they were being engaged by an entire squad. John pulled the pin on his single fragmentation grenade. He cooked it for exactly 2 seconds, counting mentally amidst the deafening roar of blind gunfire, and rolled it across the floor into the center of a group of 5 pirates huddled behind a baggage stanchion. Boom. The concussive wave blew out the remaining light fixtures, leaving the concourse in true impenetrable darkness. Screams of pain echoed through the smoke. John drew his combat knife. It was time for the quiet work. He slipped among the survivors, his movements guided by memory, sound, and the faint glow of the pirate's own tactical gear. A hand clamped over a mouth, a sharp, upward thrust beneath the ribs. A brutal elbow struck to the temple. He dismantled them methodically, efficiently, and without a single ounce of mercy. When the emergency backup lights finally flickered on 3 minutes later, casting a sickly yellow hue over the concourse, John was already gone. All 15 pirates were dead or incapacitated. The only sound was the hiss of a punctured pneumatic line and the frantic voice of Garrett Rourke screaming over the Cartel radio network. "Sector 7, report! Donovan, what the hell is happening down there? Talk to me." John stood in the adjoining corridor, wiping his bloody combat knife on his pant leg. He pressed the transmit button on his stolen radio. "Donovan isn't here," John said, his voice chillingly calm over the open frequency. "And if you don't get your men off this ship in the next 5 minutes, neither are you." Garrett Rourke stared at the radio console on the bridge, his face pale beneath his cybernetic plating. The voice on the other end wasn't the trembling, terrified tone of a civilian. It was the cold, dead voice of a professional killer. "Who the hell are you?" Rourke demanded, slamming his fist onto the comms panel. "You think you're a hero? You think you can take on an entire cartel crew by yourself?" "I don't need to take on an entire crew," John's voice crackled back. "I'm already inside your perimeter. Your men are undisciplined, loud, and blind. You've lost 19 men in 20 minutes. Do the math, Garrett. You're bleeding out, and you don't even know where the wound is." Rourke's blood ran cold. The man knew his name. He knew the casualty count. "Gideon!" Rourke roared, turning to his tech. "Trace that signal! Find out where he is!" "I'm trying, boss," Gideon sweated, his fingers flying across the keys. "He's bouncing the signal through the ship's internal PA nodes. He could be anywhere from Deck 2 to Deck 5. Rourke gritted his teeth. He had underestimated the target. He had assumed the S. Demeter was soft. Whoever this man was, he was military. Probably some ex-Earth Coalition Special Operations ghost hiding out in the outer colonies. But Rourke had a trump card. "Listen to me, you arrogant son of a bitch," Rourke snarled into the microphone. "I don't care who you are. I have over 800 of your precious colonists locked in the main atrium. Men, women, kids. I've got a heavy squad watching them. You have exactly 2 minutes to walk into the atrium with your hands on your head, or I start executing a family every 60 seconds. Starting with the cute little school teacher my boys pulled out of Deck 4. Down in the engineering bay, John listened to the ultimatum. His jaw tightened, the muscles ticking beneath his skin. He remembered Sarah Jenkins, the woman who had persistently tried to invite him to game nights. He pictured her terrified face. The military doctrine of his past dictated that the mission came first. Hostages were secondary to neutralizing the threat. But this wasn't a military mission. This was his ship. These were his people. And nobody threatened his people. "Thomas," John said over the internal comms, "do you have eyes on the main atrium through the security feeds?" "Yeah." Farrell's voice came back, shaky but resolute. "I bypassed the bridge lockout. There are 8 pirates holding them. The colonists are sitting on the floor in the center. The pirates are on the 2nd floor observation ring, looking down. It's a kill box, John. If you walk in there, they'll shred you." "I'm not walking in," John said. He pulled up the structural schematics on his datapad. The atrium was a massive 3-story open space with a glass-domed ceiling meant to simulate a terrarium. What's directly above the observation ring? The primary life support coolant reservoirs. They pump liquid nitrogen and freon into the environmental heat sinks. Can you overpressurize them remotely? Farrell hesitated. Yes. But, John, if those pipes burst, it's going to dump hundreds of gallons of freezing fog into the atrium. The temperature will drop to sub-zero in seconds. The colonists. Cold is better than dead, John interrupted. When I give the word, blow the valves on the second ring. Flood the observation deck. I want zero visibility up there. Copy that. John moved. He sprinted up the access stairs, bypassing Deck 2 entirely and heading straight for the maintenance catwalks above the atrium. He could hear the muffled cries of the hostages and the harsh, mocking laughter of the cartel guards. He crawled out onto the narrow steel beam suspended 50 feet above the atrium floor. Below him, the scene was exactly as Farrell had described. Hundreds of terrified colonists huddled together. On the circular balcony above them, 8 heavily armed pirates stood, with their rifles trained downward. In the center of the hostages, a massive brute of a pirate had Sarah Jenkins by the hair, holding a kinetic pistol to her temple. 10 seconds, Ghost! The pirate holding Sarah yelled, looking up at the security cameras. Tick-tock! John took a breath, letting his heart rate drop to a slow, methodical rhythm. He slung his rifle over his back and drew his scavenged pistol. Thomas, blow it. A deafening crack echoed through the atrium, followed by an explosive hiss of pressurized gas. The massive coolant pipes running along the ceiling of the second-floor observation ring ruptured simultaneously. Instantly, a torrential waterfall of freezing, dense white fog cascaded downward, blanketing the second floor in a blinding blizzard of liquid nitrogen vapor. The pirates screamed in shock as the temperature plummeted. Their visors frosted over instantly, and the thick fog completely obliterated their line of sight to the floor below. "I can't see a damn thing!" one of the guards yelled, firing blindly into the air. John didn't hesitate. He dropped from the catwalk. He fell 15 feet, landing perfectly on the edge of the observation balcony, right behind one of the blinded guards. The pirate turned, wiping frantically at his frosted visor. John grabbed the man's helmet, twisted violently, and snapped his neck, using the dead weight to propel himself forward into the fog. The cold was biting through his thin t-shirt like 1,000 icy needles. But the adrenaline masked the pain. He was a shadow moving through the mist. The pirates were panicking, firing wildly into the fog, effectively suppressing themselves. John moved with terrifying precision. 2 shots from the pistol took down the guard on his left. A flying knee to the chest sent another over the railing, tumbling down to the atrium floor below. Down on the floor, the heavy fog was slowly sinking, chilling the hostages to the bone, but providing a visual shield. The pirate holding Sarah cursed, realizing he was losing control. He shoved her away and raised his rifle, aiming at the balcony where the sounds of the struggle were echoing. John vaulted over the balcony railing, dropping 20 feet straight down into the center of the atrium. He hit the ground in a heavy roll, absorbing the impact, and came up in a crouch directly behind the massive brute. Before the pirate could even turn, John kicked the back of his knee, forcing the massive man to drop. In the same fluid motion, John brought the butt of his pistol crashing down onto the base of the pirate's skull. The man collapsed instantly, unconscious before he hit the deck. The atrium was dead silent, save for the hiss of the ruptured coolant pipes and the chattering teeth of the freezing colonists. The fog slowly began to dissipate near the floor. The colonists looked up. Standing in the center of the room, surrounded by the bodies of the cartel guards, was the quiet, grumpy agricultural technician. His t-shirt was torn, his knuckles were bruised and bloody, and his breath plumed in the freezing air. Sarah Jenkins stared at him, trembling violently from both the cold and the shock. John holstered his pistol and unslung his rifle. He looked down at the colonists, his eyes softening just a fraction of a degree. "Is everyone all right?" he asked, his voice steady. Before anyone could answer, the PA system crackled to life. Rourke's voice echoed through the freezing atrium, laced with sheer, unadulterated panic. "You're dead!" Rourke screamed. "Do you hear me? You're all dead! I'm overriding the core protocols! I'm detaching the bridge module and venting the rest of this ship into the vacuum of space. You have 5 minutes before the atmospheric bulkheads blow." The colonists erupted into fresh panic. Venting the ship meant instant death. John's eyes narrowed. The soft, civilian mask was gone forever. He looked at Dr. Bennett, who was clutching a frozen pipe nearby. "Doc," John said sharply, "get these people to the emergency pressure shelters on Deck 1. Move." John turned on his heel, his boots crunching on the frost-covered floor. He checked the magazine of his rifle one last time. There were no more traps, no more guerrilla tactics. It was time to go straight to the head of the snake. It was time to take the bridge. 4 minutes. That was all John had before Rourke vented the SS Demeter and turned 3,000 souls into frozen orbital debris. John sprinted up the central stairwell to Deck 1, his breathing measured despite the burning in his lungs. 2 Cartel guards blocked the final approach to the bridge. They didn't even have time to shoulder their rifles before John put 2 rounds into each of their center masses, never breaking his stride. He reached the heavy titanium blast doors of the bridge. They were magnetically sealed, glowing with a solid red lockout light. "You're locked out, Ghost," Rourke's voice barked through the bulkhead intercom, laced with hysterical triumph. 3 minutes! You can't breach Class A armor plating with small arms. Rourke was right. But John hadn't spent his first 2 weeks on Deck 4 merely pruning tomatoes. From his stolen tactical vest, John pulled a canvas sack he'd prepared days ago out of sheer, ingrained paranoia. It was packed with synthetic, high-magnesium fertilizer from Dr. Bennett's botanical lab, mixed with iron oxide he had scraped from the maintenance bay bulkheads. A crude, but incredibly potent homemade thermite charge. He slapped the heavy sack directly against the door's magnetic locking housing, shoved an emergency flare into the center, and struck it. Blinding, white-hot slag ignited. It burned at 4,000 degrees, violently melting through the reinforced titanium as if it were warm butter. The magnetic lock shrieked and shorted out, the heavy metal slag pooling on the deck. John kicked the weakened door. It crumpled inward with a heavy crash. He breached the bridge like a force of nature. Gideon, the tech specialist, scrambled for a sidearm, but John dropped him instantly with a reflex shot to the collarbone. Garrett Rourke roared, charging across the command deck. The pirate leader was terrifyingly fast, his cybernetic legs propelling him forward like a freight train. He swung a massive hydraulic-enhanced fist that would have pulverized John's skull. But John didn't try to block it. He dropped into a calculated slide, dodging the lethal blow by a fraction of an inch, and drove his combat knife directly upward into the exposed, unarmored joint behind Rourke's mechanical knee. Pressurized hydraulic fluid sprayed across the deck. Rourke screamed, his mechanical leg buckling instantly. Before the giant could recover, John was back on his feet. He grabbed Rourke by his heavy tactical harness, shoved him violently backward onto the main console, and jammed the hot barrel of his kinetic rifle directly under the pirate's chin. "Cancel the venting sequence," John whispered, his eyes like dead iron. "Now." Rourke, gasping in pain and staring into the face of absolute, unyielding death, weakly tapped his command override code into the terminal. The blaring red alarms abruptly silenced. The ship was safe. John exhaled, lowering his weapon. He hit Rourke with a brutal right cross, knocking the pirate unconscious, then systematically zip-tied the survivors to the structural pillars. 48 hours later, a heavily armed recovery cruiser docked with the Demeter. The hull bore the insignia of Academy, the Earth-based private military contractor John was contracted by. A tactical squad breached the airlock, weapons raised, expecting a bloodbath. Instead, they found dozens of Cartel pirates neatly bound in the cargo bay, completely neutralized. The Academy commander, a scarred veteran named Mitchell, slowly lowered his rifle as he spotted John sitting on a supply crate, calmly eating an apple. "Hayes?" Mitchell asked, utterly bewildered. "HQ had you listed as MIA. You were supposed to be leading our security detachment on Aegis Prime. What the hell are you doing on a pacifist farming ship?" John took a bite of the apple, looking back toward the corridor where Dr. Bennett and Sarah were waiting for him. "Clerical error," John replied flatly. "But the soil aeration is fantastic. That's a wrap on the explosive saga of John Hayes. A single paperwork typo turned a routine cartel raid into an absolute nightmare for the bad guys." If you enjoyed this HFY sci-fi thriller, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below on what kind of badass human stories you want to hear next.